Okay, I just wanted to create a small tutorial here on the topic of exporting the elevation map as a mesh in Wavefront OBJ. So that basically refers to what you see when, let's say we start with this here. We create a elevation map, maybe we painted it, or let's see, we render it on a square image. This one's 640 by 640. I'm gonna go my traditional route here with the plasma noise and maybe click it a few times until I have something I like for whatever reason. There you go. I'm going to grab also perhaps a little bit of additional brush content here. I'm gonna go, let's see, one of those that's dark. Let's give it some bright addition. Let's give it a little bit less on the opacity, something like that, and then just use that to add a little bit more detail, like raise it up a little bit higher here, kind of a mountain peak, right? And something like that. And then maybe with the darker button here, make it a little bit darker, like so. Okay, then we might want to even smooth it a little bit, adjust, or rather blur, Gaussian blur, there you go, just a tiny little bit. Okay, so we have a terrain, and I want to turn this into a 3D terrain, but on top of that I want to add some erosion effect, and let's see how we can do that. I'm going to store this image. Now you know you can do the erosion either as a filter in stylize and add that erosion right there. Now this is just going to show the erosion map as such. When you store that, you could go, let's say, switch over here, put this one in, switch back to the main image, and combine the two, perhaps in a subtractive mode, so that the bright parts here are being subtracted. Let's see if we combine that. Right click here to change the subtractive mode. There you go. So now you have a darkening river creeks or canyons, and that's essentially showing the elevation dropping down. So let's go do that and merge with swap. So that's one way to create this elevation map modifier, if you want, with the erosion. Right, we can zoom in here and basically see that that's going to create a displacement towards the lower side of the hills, which is great if you want to use it in a ray tracer, so such as, for instance, something like this here in Puppy Ray. You'll see those. Maybe we'll add some global illumination. Maybe we'll adjust the elevation just a little bit so it's not too much elevation. There you go. So that's the idea with those rivers, that erosion. But we can do that also directly inside of what should I call it? Of the 3D designer. So let me just store this one here, and so now go into 3D designer with that original. There you go, and transform 3D designer. All right. So this one doesn't have the erosion yet. I'm going to click on the more button here to see more details, and what I'll do is enable the erosion. So it applies a calculated erosion, and I can look at it from different angles now. And now I'd like to add or save this as a Wavefront OBJ file so that I can then take it into another program, a 3D program, or even your 2D image editors, photo editors, if it has a 3D layer, a 3D object capability. And many programs nowadays do, even if they are originally 2D programs. Some of them are starting, or have started quite a while ago, to support 3D meshes as well. So what we can do is we can export this. We can add perhaps a few more things before we do that, and that is, for instance, the sediments. Maybe we want to have a little bit of sediment deposit here. Let's take a close-up look here as to what that looks like. Essentially, you see the valleys being filled with some sediment, right? So that can add a great amount of nice realism. Maybe it looks like a bit, erosion sediments, or it looks like snow. That depends on the coloring that you'll give it. But let's focus on just the mesh, the 3D mesh, and you can see it now with perhaps a little bit more or less filtering, more smoothing. Adjust that, and so now here's the option down here for save OBJ. Right, so that's the export a Wavefront OBJ file, and that can be potentially a fairly large file. This one's not going to be too huge. I'm going to save it in the same folder as where I had it before. Let's see, we had 1, 2, 3. Let's call this number 2. Right, number 2. Let's go like that. And I'm on the French version of Windows, and so we may need to do one more change to that. I'm going to look at the example of earlier saves. This is what you will want to have. The Wavefront OBJ file in its current edition here, what we export is a list of vertices, and you see that here each vertex is an XYZ coordinate, and we use decimal points here. If I can zoom in a little bit, decimal points of course are used to show the fractional part. Well, when I save on my French version of Windows, it may be a little bit different. So let's see, if I open number 2, there it is. This one here has the same structure, right? You see the vertex list, but now it has a comma here, and that's because the French format for a fractional section behind the integer part of the number is not using a decimal point, it's using a comma. We may be able to fix that or change that in the future, but at this current juncture here, I'm looking at this and say, well, let's just do a Control F to find all occurrences of commas, right? Put in comma here, normal search mode, and find the next, and find how many there are, and it's about 409,000. Let's go and replace them all with a period. Right? That's the only places where we actually have the comma in this file. Trust me, I checked. And we can safely replace all these commas with periods, and click replace all. You can do that in Notepad++ easily, like I'm doing here. You can do that in Notepad. You can do that in a variety of other text editors to easily adjust if your output, if you are on a non-US English or non-English version of the operating system, and it produces a comma version of the decimal numbers. Here's a version now with the periods, and we can save it, and we're good to go to import that into another program. So just to illustrate that, here's an example in my favorite 3D all-around 3D program, but it will work easily in Lightwave or in Maya, in tons of other programs, in Photoshop too. There's some 3D layers capables there too. You probably will find this even importable into Anime Expo and some other animation programs. So let's give it a try for the other one. What I'll do is I'll delete the existing model that I had there and simply go to import, and there's my number 2, right, which I have converted. I mean, made sure that it has the decimal point period. You won't have to do that, by the way, if you are, again, if you are on the US version of Windows, or the American or the English version, perhaps even, I don't know. If you see it fail, then you'll want to check if the data needs to be converted. But at any rate, you can see that. And let's go and load that. This file is about 30 megabytes, not too big. And the dialog in this case sort of suggests using the vertex primitives. You could use facet meshes instead. I'll just use the default here and see how that goes. The import goes pretty quick. There's a little bit of additional processing needed. Internally, the data is being arranged, optimized, and some graphic display lists perhaps being created and that sort of things. So depending on how you import it, you may find a little bit of faster turnaround, but maybe some limitations as to what you can do with the mesh after it's been imported. Right, so play with that, and of course that will rest with your knowledge of your 3D program as to how you're going to do that. Let's wait for this one here to complete, and then I'll be back as soon as it's done. And we are back. So here we are now with this mesh imported, and you can see it pretty much the same way as it was in 3D Designer, with the application of the erosion paths and also the sediments. So let's see if we do a quick render on that. There you go. All right, so that's that about using the export on Wavefront OBJ. It's still relatively young as I'm using this here. This is sort of our second iteration, and we may see some additional features added, but you can already export it as is and start using that in your 3D programs. You can also store the texture if you had created one. Here is what I'm talking about when you add a texture such as sort of a snow level, snow caps, rocky and green parts in the valleys. You can also colorize that to have some snow down in the valleys. So there's a whole lot more you can do if you want to actually render it inside of Dogwaffle with Howler 9.5. But it's great if you want to just use that mesh to also export to a to another program. You can export the OBJ. You can take a look at the texture. You can take a look at storing some of the other parts like the depth map, the Z buffer. I mean, there's a variety. Even just the erosion map itself. You click on that, you'll see it right here as its own erosion map. Let's say you want to store the lighting that I currently have on that. You see that the light source comes in from the left side indeed. You can also have perhaps the colors. I don't think I have colors in the original structure of that terrain, but I do have a texture, so if I store the texture you'll see that. And one thing to notice is that the texture is not just the 3 levels based on elevation, it also has a slope, and it has the snowpack fills here. The snow sediments are being reflected here. Let's go take a look at that actually. When you see the image that's been stored here, you do see indeed all of these snow fillers inside the deeper parts of the valley. So that's an interesting thing. I'm going to store this image quick here. There you go, and now I can take a look at that simply clicking here. And so that's an interesting thing too, is that you can work with those color maps in your other programs, texture map that onto the mesh, put a UV map there or something like that. And before that, you might even want to select the snow or the green or the gray rocks to add some details to it, right? Because here it's just a plain gray, and you can make it look much more interesting if, for instance, you go to the selection here and say select by color, right? Select by color key. So if you select white, you get all the white parts selected. If you select gray, let's say here's a gray part, there you go, all the gray is selected. You can add a little bit of tolerance to that. You don't have to really, because there's only 3 main colors here. A little bit of gray variations along the edges here too. But with that, you can go, you can select. You can see what's been selected on the gray side. Everything else is kind of tinted pink if you lit it here, overlay alpha. But so with that, you could now, for instance, add, I don't know, fill some sort of a pattern to that. So let's say we go to Window, Fill Settings, right? And in the Fill Settings, select the pattern. Select some of these like cement patterns. Click on that to preview it, or maybe some brushed look, or some other some dirt, all sorts of different appearances that you can get from these patterns, and then you simply apply that onto the entire selection with the fill tool, right? So what you do is you say you want pattern fill. You don't want plain color fill, you want actually the pattern fill, and then you click image fill, I don't know, paint fill or something like that. So that didn't do it. Let's see, pattern fill, something like that. There you go. Now this is perhaps too big, so we need to have it a little bit smaller. Let's go and undo that, and we still have the selection. Let's just double check with that we have the selection. Yep, we see the marching ants, we see the pink. Let's go and do just a regular fill. There you go. So now we have that additional detail, right? Additional alterations or patterns or whatnot, and you can certainly also adjust that a little bit. You can for the patterns, or rather here, since this pattern is actually in the brush image, it's defined as the brush image, what you can do is you can reduce the size of it, and one way to do that is in the brush, simply reduce, resample it to a smaller size. And so now if you fill in here, let's go clear out and fill with the fill tool, you'll see the patterns a little bit smaller, right? So you get a little bit more detail to actually see through that. So you can do that also with the green. For instance, you want some bumpiness, like I know, something like trees, tree tops, maybe something like this, right? But you want them a little bit smaller. Again, you can go to the brush and resample that, something like this, make them really small, and so you see them here. And at that point, let's go and select again with the selection mask. Perhaps we'll store the alpha that we currently have, so we see the selection that we had originally for the rocks. That's the stored rock selection, and we can always work with that. I'll get back to that later. Let's go and select this time the green parts. So again, select by color key and see if we can select green. There you go. And so now we have the green part selected, and we still are doing a pattern fill. Let's do that over the here with the fill there. So now we filled that into wherever the green layers were, like the grass, and we get a little bit of bumpiness to that. Now this might be too much color change also, so maybe we can adjust a little bit, do the interactive undo, and go kind of find a place where we like it in between, where you have a little bit of bumpiness but not too much, and the darkness of the color stays like that. And then there's one more, of course, which is the snowpack. We might want to do something on the snowpack. Probably not a lot. If we want the snow to really look like snow, it's probably best to just leave it even and untouched. Not too much granularity to that, not too much noise, not no bumps and stuff like that. So I'll just show selecting it. Let's store the current one, the current alpha. That's the one with the green parts. So we have here the rocks. Here we have the green selections. And now let's go select also the snow. So once again, select by color key, and we can easily pick it here. And so now the snow is selected, and if we needed snow to look different, we could certainly use a pattern fill or a gradient fill or something like that, and see what kind of strange effect that might get us. So let's just check it to see it once. So we have a little bit of a gradient here going from left to right, right? So it's kind of white snow on this side and kind of darker snow on that side. Well, I mean, there's lots of other ways to fill it, depending on this vertical warp, for instance, or vertical gradient, circular gradient. There's all sorts of choices to get to a different look here. And what I'll do is I'll just leave it as white, and what I'll do next is to actually let's go Control D to clear that alpha selection. Let's store this image. That was a nice little achievement. At this point, let's go render that back in the what shall we call it, in the 3D designer. But before we do so, we load this image into the swap image. Right, this needs to go into the swap image so that we can do that directly from the stored copy here. Right, use as there, paste into swap image, scale to fit. So it's now in the swap image. You can double check that here. Click on to switch between the two. Let's go back and find our elevation map we used initially for this. I'm sure we have it here somewhere. We done better. That's not it. That's not it either. And that's still not it. There it is. Nope, that's still not it. That's the lighting map we had stored. Or that one, still not it. It's the one right there behind. There you go. There it is. That's the elevation map we started from initially. I'm going to go close a few things here that we don't need anymore. Okay. And now I'm going to go back into 3D Designer. So that's under Transform, 3D Designer. And this time you see that it still remembers to use the colors from the color map. You could switch back to just the plain color of the object. We didn't set it, it's plain white by default, but we could change to a different color here, something like that. Or we could go to, say, pick the color from the image. Since we have an elevation map where the white parts, as you see them here, white parts indicates higher elevation, the lower parts get darker, and that's because we are using the color source directly from that same image that we also use for the elevation. But of course the smartest way to use it now is with this one, where we have the image in the swap. Don't create a new texture. If you do that, it will replace it in the swap image, right? So that's why you see this warning here. But what you can do is you can now you stay with that current image, and if you zoom in a little bit, you'll see, let's see if you come in closer, you'll see that there is indeed a little bit of color variation across it, especially on the rocks, and the bumpiness on the green parts as well. And that's exactly what I was talking about, you know, adding some more detail, some interesting features that will keep the eye busy and make you think like there is some real scenario going on here with this terrain. So let's see what we can do here to pick a nice view. We definitely want to also work a little bit on, there you go, that's a good view. Let's rotate it a little bit like so. We also want to work on the atmospherics, a little bit of fog perhaps. Let's get that ready in a second. But before that, let's add a slightly different lighting. I think what we want to do is move this up a little bit and then tilt it ever so slightly like that. And so now let's focus on the lighting again. So we have, I know this was supposed to be a short tutorial on just Wavefront OBJ. I hope we covered that at the beginning, but now let's see what we do with that, right? So we have the light source that we can turn around a little bit, and also make it go lower. The altitude will allow for longer better contrast on those shading effects. And what I'll do is I'll have it come in from the left or from the right. There, from the left side, it's a nice opening, but I bring it lower even and farther away. So that's the azimuth. No, that's not the azimuth. That's the zenith. If I bring it closer, the 0 is right on top of the terrain. Let's bring it far away. Then of course we need to increase its brightness, and that's the light range. So here we go with the light range, and bring the altitude down a little bit. We can also add some shadows. Right now it's just shading it here on the dark side, but it's not actually casting shadows. And what I'd like to do is add some shadows. So we have some ray trace shadows we can add here, medium, fine, or soft. And that might be a little bit too dark. So we probably need to add a second light to brighten up the entire environment a little bit. That's why we have this second light here. So you can adjust that one the same way. You can give it high altitude, for instance, and increase the brightness of it, so that the shaded parts are still appearing shaded, but not quite that dark, because this is what it will look like otherwise, very high contrast. So give it a little bit of the appearance of ambient light, basically, is what we're simulating here with the second light source. Giving it the azimuth, you know, if it's high altitude and 0 zenith, you shouldn't see any changes in the lighting. It's right above it, but very high. If you bring it down too low, it's going to be very bright. So let's do something like this, somewhere in between here. And now, as we rotate this light source, we see the shadows being cast in real time, all on the GPU. And you can choose your lighting effects the way you want them, and then you can change the angle, and you can perhaps move in or out a little bit. Something like this. Or you might want to add a little bit of cloudiness, or some what else could we add there? Oh, some fog. Let's change the background color to something more bluish, sky-like, something like this, and then add the fog level. There you go, a little distant fog, basically, not too much, something like this, and then also ground fog, not frog. We could do a little bit of ground fog in the valley there. Let's see if we turn this around a notch. One way or another, we're going to find a really beautiful view, a scene that makes us want to be there, right? so let's see if we can keep it crisp somewhat there, and that's too much on that ground fog. Let's see, linear, adjust that a little bit. Let's do it non-linear, and then also let's see what we have here. Let's add some clouds. We can add some clouds right there. Single cloud. Let's try the sky puffies. Okay, now that's a little bit slow, so let's go and make it a faster preview and reduce the brightness a little bit. Increase the elevation. I don't know if we need to move it sideways or up. There you go. There. So you can see how all these things come together now in 3D Designer to create a nice little view of some sort of a vacation spot if you're ready to go skiing, right? And let's see what else could we do here. Ambient, a little bit ambient, the brightness, reduce the self-occlude, that gets some nice dark clouds into the mix. You can change the position, maybe move it back a little bit, or change the scale, make them smaller and more in the far distance. It's nice to have it not even all over the same, right? I mean, a plain blue sky is boring sky. A plain cloudy covered sky is kind of boring too. You want to have a little bit of variation, and a good way to do that is not to have the clouds all over, but maybe just only in part of the sky and part of the image. So let's see, you could have them in the valley, right? You could have them like this. Low remnants of fog, or you could have them up here, perhaps bring it somewhere in between there. And I would say that's my image. I can still add a little bit of variation to the lighting, which will affect not just the terrain but also the clouds, and so you can play with that. It's always a good idea to have the sun light come from the side if you want to see a good amount of shading and relief on that on those valleys, right? The shading, the dark, the bright, the contrast will come out so much nicer if you actually have relief on that. Alright, well, thanks for watching, and you know, it's only about, I think, another 1 or 2 weeks and we hopefully will have this released. It's now the last day of October, last day of August, August 31st, and we're still shooting for about middle of September, hoping to get this out to you so you can enjoy PD Howler version 9.5 very soon.